Near South Bend, Indiana, Christmas Eve, 1889. On the wintry evening of December 24th, the Larch family was having a party to celebrate Christmas. The landscape was bright with new fallen snow, yet heavy clouds hung low, making the sky dark and dreary. The windows of the farmhouse burned with the warm, cheerful light of the party as family and friends finished up the evening meal. The happy guests, beaming from a wonderful dinner, included a lawyer from Chicago who was a longtime friend of the family, a judge from South Bend, and a local minister and his wife. They were all well acquainted and had a history with each other and the Larch family. 11-year-old Oliver Larch popped popcorn for the group in the kitchen while they retired to the parlor for conversation, games, and to sing Christmas carols that Mrs. Larch's played on the organ. This was a familiar get-together that the group looked forward to every year. They truly enjoyed each other's company. A few minutes before 11 o'clock, Mr. Larch asked Oliver to run out to the well for a bucket of water to refill the drinking water crock. By now, the snow was about 6 inches deep, so Oliver put on a warm coat and some overshoes, took up a bucket, and headed out the door toward the well, which was about 75 feet from the house. Just as Mr. Larch returned to his guests, they all heard a chilly scream. "Help me! Help! They've got me! Help!" they all heard, as they jumped up to rush to the boy's aid. As Mr. Larch and the others threw open the door and lunged into the night, they were met with a terrifying silence. Oliver was not there. Literally, not more than seconds had transpired from the time he walked out of the house to hearing his screams. Holding a lantern high and walking on, they followed the boy's tracks, only to discover that they ended halfway to the well. They stood in stunned silence, not comprehending how this could be. Then they heard poor Oliver scream again. And now we come to the most horrifying fact of all. Oliver's screams were not coming from out in the woods. They were coming from up above, from somewhere overhead in that blackened sky. They could not see him, and they could not help him. All they could do was stand in disbelief as his screams for help slowly faded away. "Help! Help! Help! Help!" Later, the authorities investigated, but turned up nothing the stricken family didn't already know. How can a person just disappear like that? How does one get taken into the air? The evidence clearly showed that Oliver never made it to the well. His tracks simply stopped. Yet, there were no hot air balloons in the area, and no carrion bird could be big enough to take hold of a sturdy boy like Oliver and launch them both back into the air. It was simply impossible. Yet, something carried the boy away in front of a half-dozen witnesses. To this day, no one has ever explained how a young boy stepped off a porch for a bucket of water and vanished into the night sky. Stephen Kubacki, who went missing in February of 1978 while in the state of Michigan. Kubacki's skis and ski poles were found abandoned upon the snow and ice, and his tracks were said to have just suddenly stopped, as if he had walked out of reality with his backpack flung to the ground nearby. Since the location where he had vanished was so close to Lake Michigan, it was assumed that he had somehow fallen into the lake and drowned. Despite numerous searches, no one had any clue of where he could have gone, and he seemed to have just stepped off the face of the earth. That is, until 15 months later, when he just strolled right up to his father's house. When Kubacki was asked about what had happened to him or where he had been the whole time, his account didn't seem to make much sense. He claimed that he had suddenly woken up to find himself in a meadow around 40 miles from his father's house, and that he had been wearing clothes that were not his own, along with a small, unfamiliar bag lying next to him containing maps. none of which were his. Other than this, he had no recollection whatsoever of what had happened to him over the previous 15 months, and indeed he was under the impression that no time had passed at all. The only other clue that he could come up with was that he said he had felt as if he had done some running. It is unknown just what happened to Stephen Kubacki, and he has continued to avoid talking about it. 56-year-old James E. Tedford and his 28-year-old wife, Pearl Tedford, had moved back to Vermont at the end of World War II. At the end of his second spell of military service, Tedford returned to their rented property in Fletchertown, Franklin, Vermont, to find his wife missing. His close family claimed they had no clue as to where his wife had vanished to. The only detail they had was that they last saw her walking to the Amoco store when she disappeared. Around 1947, a lonely James Tedford checked into a soldier's home after searching for his missing wife. 2 years later, James also vanished. On December 1st, 1949, James was returning to the retirement home from Vermont when he disappeared mysteriously. The route to Bennington passed through the Green Mountain Forest. At the time, the area was renowned for creepy events, such as disappearances. All 14 passengers who boarded the bus testified to seeing him there, sleeping. However, when the bus arrived at its destination, James was gone. No one had seen the old man get off the bus at any point of the journey. His luggage remained tucked on the luggage rack of the bus. George and Jenny were in bed at a reasonable hour, as were 2 older sons and the youngest daughter, a 2-year-old. The oldest sister, 19-year-old Marion, stayed up late with the 5 middle children, but fell asleep on the couch. Jenny awoke to a ringing phone around 12:30 a.m., and she wandered downstairs to answer it. A voice she didn't recognize asked for a name she didn't know, and Jenny later told police that she'd heard laughing and glasses clinking in the background. She assumed it was a wrong number and hung up, noting that Marion was asleep on the couch. The other 5 children were nowhere to be seen, and Jenny assumed they were asleep in their attic bedroom. All the phone lines seemed to be down. Jenny awoke to the smell of smoke and the sound of a roaring fire about an hour after the phone call. She and George escaped with their 2-year-old. Marion and the 2 older sons escaped too, but the 5 middle children were nowhere to be seen as the family ran from the burning house. Marion tried to reach the fire department by phone from a neighbor's house, but there was no operator to respond. Somebody else who saw the blaze tried to call for help from a nearby tavern, but couldn't get through. It took somebody driving into town to personally find the fire chief before help could be summoned. By then, it was too late. George tried to save the missing children, but was thwarted at every turn. As George realized 5 of the children were still inside the burning home, he ran for the ladder he left laying beside the house so he could reach an upstairs window, but the ladder was missing. Thinking fast, he worked to move a truck close enough to the home that he could use it to reach the windows instead, but neither of the trucks would start, despite being in good working order earlier. The fire chief said he found remains in the rubble. According to the fire chief, the children had died in the blaze, and their remains had been incinerated by the heat. But that didn't jive with what the Sodders learned 2 years after the blaze. The chief had apparently told somebody else he found a human heart in the rubble, but decided to quietly bury it and forgot to tell George and Jenny of his discovery. When the Sodders heard this, they demanded the chief show them where the heart had been buried. A funeral director identified the object as a beef liver. Rumors of sightings led the Sodders to believe the children didn't die in the fire. One woman said she saw the children peering from a car that sped away from the burning home. Another person said she saw them at a hotel and served them breakfast in a restaurant the morning after the fire. The Sodders hired private investigators to chase leads and tips, but the children were never found. In the 1960s, Jenny received an envelope that contained a photo of a man who looked like the adult version of her son Louis, one of the missing 5 children, but nothing ever came of that lead either. The last living Sodder child died in 2021 without ever finding out what happened to her missing siblings.